Magic, Trade, Ambassadors, and Instruments. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how the developments of science played out for people living in post-plague 14th to 16th century Europe. The Renaissance brought a new heavens and a new earth to scholars across Europe. And the discoveries of those 2 centuries were momentous. The whole of science as we know it, and the whole way we see our position in the universe, changed. But keep in mind, nearly 90% of Europeans were agricultural workers. Few of them could read and write. Most would never travel very far from home. The state of the planet and where it was in the universe mattered far less than the daily weather and if the crops grew. Famines, which were unthinkable in Europe now, were a regular occurrence. Europe takes center stage, but not all Europeans do. We spent time in China and the Middle East and the Americas. Between 1405 and 1433, the Chinese sailed out into the known world looking for anyone more impressive than themselves. They sent out flotilla of 9-masted junks, huge ships led by a general and a master mariner, and they got all the way to Africa. They decided not to carry on with these very expensive voyages, perhaps a little bit like the U.S. stopped going to the moon. And I did not mention, but this is true, that a series of back-and-forth massacres and conflicts is recorded in both Arab and Chinese sources for traders in coastal trading cities in China around the 800s. In other words, these 2 great powers had relationships with each other that had nothing to do with Europe or the rest of the Western world. And that continues to be true today. For instance, China is heavily invested in Egyptian infrastructure and is developing a presence in most African countries. In the Americas, civilizations in the North and the South engaged with star observation and metalworking, but the Maya are alone in developing a written language. Before European contact, we know that the Maya invested time, energy, and generations of observations in service to the elite who ruled their cities or their polities. Their concept of time ran into the trillions of years, which is unique. I asked you to think about what science looks like under the different concept of what problems need to be solved. What are those things to keep your eye on in the history of science? They include the story of the atom, our ideas about the shape of the historical length of the universe and time and how it should be tracked, the big cultural projects we undertake, and the way we choose to employ science and technology to solve daily problems. This is the history of science. Who is at the table is also something to keep your eye on. What are the key terms and ideas you need to remember from this class? First, the definition of science itself. Then we need to think about progress and what does it mean, in terms of a tool or in terms of people. Then we also need to think about how progress happens. We have observers, we have problems, we have instruments, and we have big organizing ideas. Another key idea in this course is how historians work. Historians typically ask 3 different kinds of questions. Did it happen? Does it matter? And could it have happened any other way? Historians also think about significance in 5 different ways: in permanence, in magnitude, in potential, in quality, and in loss. Finally, we've asked the question, when can we start the story of science? What do you need in order to be a scientist? I've told you that there's something called the sink of wealth, which is generally an idea that when there are rich people, they tend to start big projects that need scientists. We also have talked about the difference between basic science and applied science, meaning things that really don't necessarily lead to any specific invention and things that are absolutely applied to problems that we all have. Last but not least, we talked about skills and knowledge table for one, meaning if you don't convey your ideas to somebody else, they may be lost, and sometimes the people who are allowed to have ideas are really very narrow. How do we begin to see science as a visible expression in the Renaissance? Well, as we have already seen, architecture is an important space for competition and display. One notable example is the Duomo, completed in 1436 by Brunelleschi. Standing in the center of Florence, it is among the largest of domes in Italy and it's a technical achievement like that of the Hagia Sophia. It was built in layers with a double shell and with bricks laid in a herringbone pattern going up. It was done without scaffolding, and it was considered to be, and in fact it was, a mathematical and architectural marvel. At the end of the period we are looking at, the Blue Mosque was completed in 1616. It is the opposite, within view and walking distance from the Hagia Sophia. In the city of Istanbul, it anchors and establishes Islam as a serious power in the city. The dome is about 14 stories tall. It's 141 feet. So architecture continues to be one of the places for science and math in the service of faith and power. In 1482, at the age of 30, Leonardo da Vinci wrote to the Duke of Milan, "Here you see what he feels comfortable promising: bridges, ladders, trains, mining, cannons, tanks, hurling catapults, fireproof shelters, buildings, artwork, and bronze." It would be a completely unbelievable letter now, but Leonardo went on to become not a famous engineer or a war profiteer, but rather the famous artist who painted the Mona Lisa, and also a man known for his inventions. His careful studies of cadavers, of anatomy, was one of the links he made between nascent science and art. These anatomical drawings are beautiful studies of the complex layering within the body. Leonardo roomed with and was friends with Luca Pacioli, a monk who taught math and double-entry bookkeeping. Leonardo illustrated in a book by Luca on mathematics called De Divina Proportione, the Divine Proportion, also known as the Golden Ratio. The Golden Ratio is an artistic organizing scheme, a representation of how things grow in nature, and a mathematical irrational number that extends into infinity and does a lot of interesting things as a number. This is definitely a fun and broad topic, so I've squirreled it with 5 sources. Please feel free to explore. Both Leonardo and Luca had the gift of explaining and making clear what is complicated. In the middle is Leonardo's illustration of a rhombocubohedron, that is 18 squares and 8 triangles. Leonardo didn't paint it, but on the right is a portrait of Luca and a student. Some people think the student is the artist Albrecht Dürer. In front of Luca is his own book, a slate, and hanging from the ceiling is a water-filled glass model. A close inspection of the model shows a reflection of an outside scene and the sky. I love Luca because I've read his instructions on double-entry bookkeeping. It's a combination of soul-reckoning, math, and life advice. Their lives and interests and work are a pretty good illustration of the multifaceted nature of living in this period. No one said, "Hey, you can't do all of those things. You can't do painting and math and medicine and bookkeeping and teaching and make tanks." Well, it sounds lovely to be given the freedom to just learn, right? But the Renaissance was definitely not a peaceful time to just build and paint and learn math and teach bookkeeping. After 17 years in Milan, both men had to run for their lives in 1499 when the French invaded the city. Well now, what about the line between science and magic? Magic is a tricky term. We use it today to mean 2 things. The first is you fooling me with something that looks like a wonder, but we both know it isn't. The other is you trying to get in touch with the spiritual realm and any non-corporeal beings within it to influence the material things that happen in daily life and your colleagues. For instance, witches at a cauldron, warlocks casting spells, and so on. Our author, Patricia Farah, spends a fair bit of time with the Christian mystic and heretic John Dee. He practiced magic. Well, if Dee practiced magic, why on earth is he part of the history of science? Let's see. Dee was a mathematician. He was a cartographer and a book collector. He had over 4,000 books, which is enormous for that time and, in fact, also for our time. He got his degrees from Cambridge and was elected a fellow, and he traveled in what is now Holland, working with Gerard Mercator, whose maps you will see at the end of this lecture. Dee helped plan English expeditions to Canada and edited an English translation of Euclid's Geometry. He was a court advisor to Elizabeth I in math and medicine, and he was a promoter of national exploration by developing instruments and improving navigation with math. Dee is called a mystic because he believed that there was such a being as Hermes Trismegistus, the founder of magical and alchemical investigations. He believed that Hermes had lived as a contemporary of Moses in the Old Testament of the Bible. The writings of Hermes Trismegistus were eventually discovered to be a forgery, maybe dating to the time of Constantine in 300 AD, so that's well after Moses. The ideas are a mixture of Platonism and Stoicism together with Jewish and Persian philosophy, but he was a popular mythical figure in the Renaissance. And this on the left is a picture of Hermes Trismegistus set in the Siena Cathedral floor. Dee consulted with angels and he tried to do magic. And that makes him a heretic because Christians are explicitly told in the Bible not to meddle with angels or to try to contact the dead or to do magic. Leaving doctrine out of it for a moment, I think if you met Dee today, he'd be like a really successful NASA scientist who advances space travel with amazing mathematical research, but also believes that aliens are telling him how to do it. In other words, if you hunt around on YouTube or late night radio, you can find people exactly like Dee in the field of science right now. Being really smart and practically useful doesn't mean you might not hold some wacky ideas. Well, Farah puts him in the line of science because he, like other alchemists, was trying not only to catalog but also to understand and change the basic elements of nature. Dee worked for Elizabeth, but voyages to the New World had been happening since the previous generation, meaning Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII. And this is a painting of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's older sister. It was made and then lost and then recopied for Charles I. The original is noted to have been painted around 1515 when Margaret was 26. Margaret is apparently holding a marmoset. Now who would have given her a marmoset in 1515? The first voyage to Brazil was in 1493, and Scotland is a long way from Brazil and a lot colder too. There are, as far as I can tell, no records telling who painted this picture or who commissioned it or what the occasion was. So what can we guess? We know her husband, James, King James, spoke Spanish and was friendly with the Spanish ambassador. Ambassadors in the Renaissance had a somewhat different set of duties. They were expected to bring and exchange expensive gifts and often asked to arrange for exotic animals to be shipped to their royal employers. King James had, for instance, a lion from Africa, which must have been a nightmare to send on a Renaissance ship, both for the sailors and the lion. He could have requested a marmoset from his Spanish connections and then commissioned a painting, hoping to show the world his acquisitions of an English princess and a Spanish monkey. But if the correct date really is 1515, then Margaret's husband James had died in battle in 1513, in battle with her brother Henry's forces, as it happens. Her brother killed her husband, which is pretty sad. So it is less likely that this picture was commissioned by James to represent his collections or his status. We do know that right after James died, Margaret came to England for a while. Henry was married to Catherine, this Spanish princess and heiress. So, at a guess, Henry might have paid for new clothes and also paid to have this picture made in order to put his sister Margaret back out on the marriage market. He may have wanted to make a new strategic alliance using a painting. And that was another duty of ambassadors, to bring expensive portraits of royals to other courts to find potential brides or grooms. You can kind of think Renaissance online dating. So, on behalf of the funder and patron, Henry, the painter could be showing potential suitors that the English royal family had access to New World goods and Spanish connections. We also know that Henry VIII himself apparently collected marmosets because they show up in pictures with his young son Edward later on. So my bet is that this monkey in this picture is a symbol of the English-Spanish alliances and wealth. I will add that Henry's divorce from Catherine, the Spanish princess, was still in the future. So what happened? Did the painting work? Not exactly. Margaret, without her brother's permission, remarried a Scottish nobleman, the Earl of Angus, in 1514. Margaret didn't bring her brother Henry the alliances he had hoped for. Nevertheless, it was her great-grandson James VI that carried on the royal English line to King Charles I, and it was Charles I who paid to have this painting restored. Why? In a sense, this painting is unique because it had two patrons and two purposes. Perhaps Charles was putting the family inheritance, legitimacy, wealth, and power back on display. Charles could have been reinforcing the idea that he, like his ancestors, had the ability to marshal scientific knowledge and luxury. Unfortunately for him, it didn't end well. The English revolted against him and Charles was beheaded in 1649. So this painting maybe didn't accomplish its goal either time. Who can say? At any rate, it is like other paintings of the time, where the super rich show their interest in New World species because they can acquire them as luxury items. The science of discovery and the collection of wonders belong to princes and kings. Where else does scientific interest show up amongst the wealthy? This picture, painted by Hans Holbein in 1533, shows the French ambassador to England and the Bishop of Navarre, both French. They're young men, both in their 20s. They held important political appointments. They're prosperous and educated as their rich clothing and surroundings demonstrate. What else can you see in this picture? The upper left has a celestial globe which shows the constellations and also a portable sundial. These are the instruments of navigation and scientific exploration. The world was first circumnavigated in 1522, about 11 years before this picture was painted. Now below is a lute with a broken string, flutes, and a Lutheran hymn book, a math book, and an earth globe. The Lutheran hymn book and the lute represent the split with the Catholic Church and the broken discord of the Church. The globe shows the latest knowledge of the continents and, again, the studies of math that help navigation. So these men are positioned to display wealth, interest in science and the arts, and knowledge of religious and intellectual arguments. But the oddest, and in some ways the most interesting thing in this picture, is the anamorphic skull. What's that, you ask? An anamorphic image is a distorted image which becomes clear when seen from the correct angle. This is what the skull looks like when the correction is made, the angle is corrected. This skull is a display of Holbein's skill as a draftsman, but it also suggests that Holbein was working with some specialized mirrors. Now, here are a couple of examples of these anamorphic mirrors and how they work. You can see a chair on the left reflected in the mirror from the drawing, and you can see a frog on the right. So why is that interesting, you ask? It's a tiny indicator of continuously crossing paths in science and technology. The technique for painting in this way was developed in the Ming Dynasty. That's the dynasty that sent out those voyages to the west. It was carried along the Silk Road to the west, and then, curiously enough, the technique was carried back to China by the Jesuits in the 1580s. Chinese painters and Western painters accomplished this specialized technique differently. The Chinese seem to draw these pictures freehand, and the Westerners used these carefully gridded out math and angles of incidence. And I've put in a link to somebody drawing a skull for anamorphic representation, apparently freehand, and you can look up some other information on this topic because it's kind of fun. So we've looked at two practicing scholars, John Dee and Leonardo da Vinci. Both used specialized instruments and math and were influential in their day. One is famous in the history of science and one is not. We see royal princes, kings, and queens positioning themselves as supporters of new knowledge and discovery, using exotic animals as the evidence. And we do know that painters were supposed to do some clever work with math, mirrors, and optics. But it's also important to look at how other kinds of problems are addressed, the problems that link the past to the present, like how do we stay warm or get enough to eat? Science isn't just a string of inventions, it's the history of how we use tools and organizing ideas to address common concerns. We're going to talk about staying warm next week, but for this week, how about eating and training? In the time of the Renaissance and Reformation, when the scientific revolution was unfolding, salt was very important. Then the flow of spices and silver and gold drove trade from the New World to Asia. Salt and spices and gold and silver shaped politics, trade, and exploration, and those economic drivers also shaped scientific problem solving. Let's look at salt. This is choucroute. It's a French version of sauerkraut. So what kinds of things can be salted? You see in this picture meats, especially fish, but also ham, cheese, cabbage, and pickles. Now, perhaps you haven't had the occasion to think about it, but salt allowed people to preserve food beyond the day, and so it allowed survival across the seasons. Without salt, no village can survive the winter. Far in the future, refrigeration was the answer to food preservation, but at this point in our story, it's salt that does the job. Even as the Middle Ages developed field rotation systems and the horse collar, which made soil much more productive, there were still famines almost every 5 years in one part of Europe or another during the Renaissance. Having salted food was a matter of survival. Even as salt is a humble and local and domestic kind of science, it's also the foundation of empires. Without salt, no army can march. Many empires and states used a salt tax to fund those armies, crusades, and building projects. The Chinese, for instance, had a long-standing salt taxation system. In Europe, the French had a taxation system, the Germans did too. And if this topic interests you, you can look up Mark Kurlansky's excellent book, Salt, A World History. Salt is also a way to look at the gap between the rich and the poor, between the farmers and the rulers. I guess you may have a salt shaker in glass or in pottery, but here is a salt cellar made in gold. This is the Cellini salt cellar made in 1543 for Francis I of France. When the rich wanted to put salt on the table, they did it like this. Neptune, the sea, is on the right and Tellus, the earth, is on the left. Salt is on his side and pepper is on hers. By the time of the Renaissance in Europe, gold and silver were in short supply. Traders were eager to find new sources of these precious metals. They were also eager to find new routes to the Asian spices. And they wanted those silks that were desired by the wealthy European customers. So let's look at how the motivation to get gold and silver and spices generated new observers and new tools to support mapping and navigation. Consider that Christopher Columbus was a Genoese. He came from a city that fought with Venice for control of the eastern trade flowing through Constantinople. He was sponsored by the Spanish, who wanted to contest the Portuguese for dominance of the new trade routes. Now, in the early 1400s, when the Chinese rulers decided to stop, they just stopped. They didn't have any rivals to beat. But the Europeans, coming from these smaller states, had riches to win from each other. They wanted to wrest control away from the Arab middlemen and be able to profit more directly from goods like coffee beans from Ethiopia, or the spices that traveled up from India, and the Malacca Islands, or the ginger, silk, and tea that came from China. So Columbus sailed west. Amerigo Vespucci sailed for the Medici in 1499, 1501, and 1503. Then, almost 20 years later, Magellan, a Portuguese native whose ships were sponsored by Spain, sailed around the world from 1519 to 1522. And just a reminder that neither the Italians, nor the Spanish, nor the Portuguese, all of whom were amazing sailors and explorers, had a telescope or knew that the Earth went around the sun. Metaphorically and in reality, it's instructive to think about what you don't have to know in order to navigate the world. But how did these voyagers and explorers organize the world? On the left is a medieval TO, or world map. It was published in a kind of encyclopedia called the Etymologiae, written by Isidore of Seville, a church father in the early Middle Ages. It shows Asia, Europe, and Africa, surrounded by the sea in the shape of an O, and divided by a central sea in the shape of a T. And that's the Mediterranean. This encyclopedia was printed 10 times between 1470 and 1529. In other words, these medieval understandings of the world persisted well into the Renaissance. On the right is another map from a psalter produced around 1265 and currently held by the British Library. Here we see Jerusalem, God's city, at the red center of the map. A map could and often was organized by items of interest or importance and not necessarily by geographical proximity. So these are some of the maps that the sailors or voyage planners would have known about. However, sailors frequently consulted different and more practical guidebooks called portolans, which are pictured here. These describe the coastline and the well-known ports and paths of the winds from one place to another. It seems that most captains sailed with either this or with their own accumulated experience to guide them. Shortly after Columbus's voyages, we begin to see something that looks a bit more like what we know. You can see Africa there, you can see something like the Americas, you can see Europe and something like Asia. So I'm going to quote the Library of Congress website partially on this map because it does offer a really good overview of the issues. This map grew out of an ambitious project in a little village in France, and it was put together during the first decade of the 16th century. The thought was they were going to document and update new geographic knowledge. They were going to capture it all and put it in one new great big map. And this was a research effort. They were going to gather data particularly from the Amerigo Vespucci voyages, which went from 1501 to 1502 to the New World. So Waldseemüller christened the new lands America because he recognized that Vespucci had been the first guy to really recognize he was someplace new. And this is the only known surviving copy of the 1,000 maps that are believed to have been printed. So this represents a revolutionary new geography. It's the first one to depict clearly a separate Western Hemisphere, separate from Asia, with the Pacific as a separate ocean. This represents a huge leap forward in knowledge. They get it. There's an America. There's a whole other continent. And that really changes the European understanding that they had started with, which is there's just Europe, Asia, and Africa. Now they understand there's another part of the world. This is Magellan's famous circumnavigation of the globe from 1519 to 1522. Scientific progress usually has more than one impetus and almost always comes in a complicated context. I'd like for you to consider the people and the connections that are gathered by this voyage. First, there's Christopher Columbus, who made 4 voyages to the New World but didn't manage to get across to the other side. He never understood what he had actually found. Columbus treasured the Bible given to him by none other than Pope Alexander VI from the Borgia family. Now, Alexander is among the most infamous of popes, and his actions as a libertine laid some of the groundwork for the Reformation. His Borgia family was a rival in trade and in politics to the Medici family. The Medici funded the American expeditions that changed the maps. When the Medici popes edged out the Borgia in the Catholic Church in 1513, the corruption of Leo X really actually launched the Reformation. So businessmen and popes and monarchs helped sponsor these trips of discovery. Columbus went on behalf of Isabella and Ferdinand. Amerigo Vespucci, for whom the American continents are named, traveled to the New World for the influential Medici family, specifically for Lorenzo di Pier Francesco di Medici. Ferdinand Magellan, of Portuguese nationality, having been refused by the King of Portugal, asked for it and received support from the Spanish to sail to the Spice Islands. Magellan's ships, sailing from 1519 to 1522, were exploring the world at the same time as Martin Luther, the founder of the Reformation, spurred on by the Pope's sale of indulgences, was translating the New Testament into German for the German-speaking people. So think back to our painting of the ambassadors in the lute with a Lutheran book of hymns. New worlds of belief and new worlds of geography were opening up at the same time. That's why, in some ways, the idea that the Earth wasn't the center of the known universe was so destabilizing. Everything was undergoing change. The huge and important change in the common understanding of the universe and the solar system came on the heels of these voyages. So consider again this diagram of the heavens and the known planets. Aristotle is the codifier of this system of beliefs. As you see, the Earth is believed to sit at the center, and then the Moon and Mercury and Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. 1,000 years later, from Aristotle, this understanding still governed everywhere. And literally it governed everywhere because rulers and city officials across Europe employed astrologers who used the motions of the planets to predict what might happen every year. This is not so different from the Maya. Nicholas Copernicus, who proposed the modern solar system, started in Krakow University, studying mathematics with a particular focus on astronomy. When he finished, he was put up for a position in the church, but he wasn't accepted right away, so he went on with his studies at Bologna in Italy. There he got a job working as an assistant to the principal astrologer of the University of Bologna, Domenico Maria Novara. Now, what did the university astrologer had to do? He had to make annual predictions for the city, for its weather, for the fate of its princes, and for the various groups of people within the city. Copernicus worked with Domenico Maria Novara on recording observations, but he seems to have steered clear of the perilous work of predicting earthly events. After another stint studying medicine at Padua, Copernicus finally took a teaching post from his uncle in Warsaw. It seems he had his ideas about a sun-centered solar system worked out when he was in his early 40s, but he delayed publishing until the last year of his life when he was 70. This is his illustration of his ideas from his 1543 publication, 6 Books Concerning the Revolution of the Heavenly Orbs. He feared some kind of backlash would come, and it did, but not right away. When it was first published, his ideas, they were generally accepted, and other people expressed interest and a little bit of approval. It wasn't until about 60 years later that the Catholic Church registered its objections. Galileo Galilei was famously condemned to house arrest by the Catholic Church for promoting and defending the new system, in 1633. Galileo is a familiar symbol of the scientific revolution. There are many known and unknown people who contributed to knowledge of the natural world, but Galileo's range of curiosity, studies, and discoveries give him preeminence. Galileo was born in 1564, after the Peace of Augsburg, and died in 1642, before the end of the 30 Years' War. In other words, he lived during the time that the Catholic Church was defending itself from innovation and intellectual attack. Galileo's father was a lute player. He himself held the chair of mathematics at the University of Padua, and later the non-teaching position of professor to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo I. Cosimo, a Medici, but not one of the very famous ones, consolidated the art collections of his ancestors in the Uffizi. He also became a patron of the sciences through his support of Galileo. Now Galileo, look at the face, you can see this. He was a contentious man, constantly in a wrangle with someone, and since the most educated people of his day were in the church, he was constantly in a battle with one or another churchman about mathematics or the moon or the theory of the solar system. Late in life he was condemned by the Catholic Church and lived the end of his life under house arrest. He had 2 daughters and a son, and both of his daughters became nuns. In 1610, Galileo published The Starry Messenger, in which he recorded his sightings of the moons of Jupiter. Pictured here is a model of one of his original telescopes made by himself, and most of what he published no other human being had seen. These, in fact, are his own illustrations of the moon. Copernican theory supporting a sun-centered solar system was condemned in 1616. Nevertheless, in 1632, Galileo published his Dialogue on the Two World Systems, which quite clearly supported the Copernican theory. Galileo had many friends among the universities and in the papal court, but when he argued that the earth revolved around the sun, the Italian church scholars saw this idea as unsupported by facts, unsupported by observations, and also as a threat to the centrality of man in God's universe. Really, these arguments back and forth weren't all about theology or even about who had made the more accurate observations. Galileo wrote an imaginary dialogue between 2 people about which system was right, that is, the earth-centered system or a sun-centered system. Galileo created a character called Mr. Simpleton, and he put into Mr. Simpleton's mouth the Pope's opinion that the universe was earth-centered. In other words, he held the Pope up for mockery when he was making his argument. People are surprised that Galileo got in trouble, but it's actually maybe just as surprising that he got off as lightly as he did. There are 3 essential instruments that changed the world from the one Galileo lived in to the one we live in. They are the clock, the telescope, and the microscope, instruments that measure time and space. Galileo was involved with all of them. His work with the pendulum established that objects fall at the same rate That's kind of clock work. His work with the telescope helped to establish that we live in a solar system and that the moon has mountains, that Jupiter has moons, and that the Milky Way is a band of thousands of stars. He also helped to develop the compound microscope. This week, you're not reading Professor Thomas Kuhn. His book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is very dense, and I'd love to have you read it, but it is very dense. It's a major and important work. He argues that the reasons people change their minds are complex. They are influenced by the belief of others, especially others who are important or influential. Kuhn says that a new theory has to do a better job of describing or solving existing puzzles or problems than the old theory does. But also, he says that you have to already believe in order to start seeing, which is certainly not the way that most people think that scientific breakthroughs happen. He calls this a paradigm shift. Kuhn is one of those landmark thinkers and writers. Everyone in the history of science has to argue with him, and no one in the field can ignore him. How do people change their minds? What convinces them? In a way, there wasn't really enough evidence for people to start changing to believe in the new sun-centered system, but they did. Have a look at this new Mercator map. It's from 1587, and it isn't accurate, but it is as accurate as it could be for that time. There is, however, something interesting on it that I'd like you to notice. Antarctica is on the map. Nobody had yet sailed to Antarctica, and yet there it is represented. Why is it there? I'll leave this little mystery to you. I'll see if you can figure it out.